So with that said, I'd like to sort of maybe frame the conversation around the following provocative question. And it's sort of a paradox, I think, at the heart of critical rationalism. And the question is this. So why is it that a philosophy that's so focused on progress and solving problems has had approximately zero cultural impact? So... All right, so we are here today with Kasra. Kasra, thanks for joining us on the pod.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so the main focus of the conversation is we're gonna talk about an essay you wrote criticizing Deutschianism, Popperianism, basically everything that Baden and I stand for. So you really went for the gut on that one. Thank you very much for that. But before we dive into that, I wanted to just make the audience maybe slightly more familiar with you for those who haven't heard of you before. So what are you up to right now? And maybe talk a bit about both your job and your writing and where you're at in life at the moment.
Yeah. It's great to be here. Long time listener, first time participant. I'm Kasra. I am a software engineer part-time by day, and I spent the rest of my time writing online, tweeting a lot. I also host a lot of events. I'm currently in San Francisco, and that's where I do a lot of sort of meditation nights, salons, intellectual conversations, and stuff like that. But yeah, my writing and sort of intellectual work has been very focused, on a lot of different things, but philosophy has been a pretty central topic of inquiry for me. And I basically spent, we'll probably get into this when we talk about the essay, but I got into Deutsch maybe a few years ago around the pandemic, got really into him, read a lot of his work and Popper's work. And over time, began to notice what I thought were flaws in their work. And, that's what that essay I wrote was about. And yeah, but that's me.
Yeah, nice. Do you actually remember how we met? So I know we've met up once in person before, but mostly we chat online. And then I was trying to rack my brains for like how we actually first came into contact, and I'm not sure how that happened.
Yeah, I remember DMing you a while back. I think I saw your podcast somewhere. I DM'd you, and you were like, "Oh yeah, you can join our Discord." And then at some point, I want to say one of us reached out, and we must have had like a video call, and that was it. And then we met up in person. I think in like the Bay. I want to say I was like,
yeah, I think in SF.
Yeah, it was at like a restaurant, and right, because you were at Stanford at the time.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Nice. I think that was the first.
I didn't realize you were in our Discord too. That's sweet. Cool.
Yeah, I am. I'm not very active, but yeah.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
Occasionally. Yeah.
And so, I'm curious how you decide what to write about on any given day, because your writing really runs the gamut from like anywhere between very introspective sort of self-help style work to like hardcore science that ends up on the front page of Hacker News, which I'm not jealous of at all, by the way. I don't say that with any envy whatsoever. And so how do you span both of these worlds simultaneously?
That is like the central question of my life. I have no idea. I started my newsletter with really not much of a clear sense of, what it was going to be about. And in some ways that's still the case today. Like I guess I'm really curious. I like learning about different things, and I try to be very honest. So it's like whatever has been most salient, most top of mind for me, I want to write about. And there has been these two threads, like of, one side is the more personal, introspective writing. I've, always been very into meditation and inner work, psychological change and stuff like that. And I explore that a lot. And that's a lot of the more, I call it like the journal section of my newsletter. And then there is, there is the intellectual side. I've always been, again, sort of into philosophy. I was, read a bit of Wittgenstein in college and thought I understood what he said at the time. And I think now I'm like, I don't think I had any idea what I was talking about. But anyway, like that early interest has continued, and I, whatever rabbit holes I'm recently diving into, I try to write about. The big thing like this past year, and that I want to focus more on, is like biology, but also specifically how ideas in biology give us interesting perspective on like other questions, like about life and how it informs our ideas about philosophy, or how philosophy informs biology.
Do you have any examples?
Yeah. So like one of the longer essays I wrote last year was this piece on Michael Levin's research. And that was the one that famously made it to the front page of Hacker News, which is also in my only time thus far, but I'm hoping there will be more of those. He basically talks about cells having agency. It's like this idea that cells are not, like the idea that agency and intelligence is not just something we find in like humans and in human brains, but it's like you can see traces of it in lower level systems, all the way from like organ systems down to individual cells. And taking that perspective gives you, so that's a bit of a philosophical shift in how we think about intelligence. And then that gives you interesting ideas about experiments you can do on cells, where, he shows that like, I think it was like, he made these like xenobots, like little robots made out of stem cells, and you're not changing the genes, you're just kind of altering the way the cells, I think it was literally like the shape that the cell, like taking a piece of the embryo, cutting it out, altering this shape, and then it like becomes a self-replicating machine, basically. And the idea is like cells have these latent capabilities. They have this innate intelligence or creativity. And then in experiments, you try to like bring that out.
Yeah, we'll link to the piece, and we'll link to your Substack in general, which I encourage everyone to go sign up for. It's great. It. And because you write about such a wide variety of topics, it's very exciting to get a new essay from you, because I'm like, I don't know what this is going to be about, but it's going to be about something random. So that's great. Okay. So let's dive in to the controversial subject at hand. Maybe I should just begin with the prelude that sort of everything I guess I'll say in this episode, I sort of say as someone who is very sympathetic to Deutschianism and Popperianism, obviously. Like, I view those two thinkers as more formative to my worldview than possibly anyone else. And so, but I'm sure even just by having this conversation, I'll come across as like somewhat critical. So I just wanted to put the initial caveat out there, for the Deutschians in the audience who are sitting in their chair getting very angry that perhaps I'm not pushing back more, etc. This is all done in the spirit of love. So with that said, I'd like to sort of maybe frame the conversation around the following provocative question. And it's sort of a paradox, I think, at the heart of critical rationalism. And the question is this. So why is it that a philosophy that's so focused on progress and solving problems has had approximately zero cultural impact? So like, why in some sense have they failed on this metric of like really moving the needle on a lot of cultural conversation? So, there's, I would say, a small set of devoted adherents to these two thinkers, Karl Popper and David Deutsch. We can call them like the Popperian jihadists, maybe, right? And they're surrounded by a much larger group of people who have, and these include professional philosophers who may have read Popper and Deutsch and may even take interest in some of their ideas, but don't find their ideas to be groundbreaking or as illuminating as this sort of small circle of devoted adherents. And so, off the top of your head, there are several possible answers to this question. You could, of course, argue that I'm just wrong here, that there actually has been cultural impact. So you might point to people like Naval Ravikant or George Soros, or like some, certain academics like Paul Meehl, Peter Medawar, David Deutsch, of course. And you could try and locate the impact there. And then there's a conversation to be had about whether those people actually were influenced in their sort of scientific and intellectual work by Karl Popper, or just sort of took like a passing philosophical interest in his work. Or you might even point to like more recent people like our friend Aaron Stupel, who just wrote a book about parenting, right? That is ostensibly based on the philosophy of Karl Popper. So you could argue I'm just wrong about the cultural impact. But I think if we look at other online communities like Effective Altruism or, the very new Progress Studies movement, or even something like AI Doomerism, I think arguably those movements, even though some of them are smaller probably in numbers than critical rationalism, have had more impact on the current public conversation. Okay, so second reason is you might argue that it's just because the movement is young and hasn't had that much time to grow yet, so we're just like, it's early days of this thing. Yeah, this is possible, but again, a lot of these other movements that are definitely moving the needle on a lot of, in terms of public conversation are equally as new, if not more so. So EA, progress studies, et cetera, et cetera. Third, you might argue that not enough people really understand critical rationalism. And I think this is a go-to defense for a lot of critical rationalists, right? I think a lot of people would argue that, like, sure, a lot of people have read Popper and have read Deutsch, but haven't really fully internalized the ideas. And like, once you really get it, once you really dive in, once you really understand what they're trying to say, then it's sort of impossible to ignore their insights. And so insofar as people aren't adopting these ideas or changing their behaviors, et cetera, to align with some of these ideas, it's because they don't get it, right? This is like somewhat weak to me, or at least I don't love appealing to this sort of reason, because you can sort of always levy this sort of criticism, right? This is like a no true Scotsman fallacy style argument where you just say, well, if they don't adopt Popper, it's because they didn't get it, right? And like you can sort of always say that. So that one makes me slightly uncomfortable, although undoubtedly there are times when it is true, right? Like there are certainly ways that Popper is misconceived in sort of the public philosophical imagination, as it were. Fourth, it could be something like sociological, right? It could just be like the online community has adopted a certain set of cultural norms that make impact hard, right? So like in the language of Deutschianism, like maybe they've adopted some anti-rational means or something that are just keeping it hard from them making progress and stuff. Or finally, you could argue that there's something in the philosophy that is actually just wrong. And that's why the impact is limited. And that, in some sense, is the most straightforward answer. And is usually the answer people reach to about other philosophers, right? Like, pick your favorite philosopher. And if you ask, like, why isn't David Benatar had more impact? A lot of people just argue, well, it's because he's wrong about antinatalism, right? And so I view your essay as basically, you framed it much more nicely and less provocatively, perhaps, than I framed it. But I basically view you sitting in this fifth camp where you just say, why hasn't it made more impact, right? It's because there are certain fundamental flaws in the philosophy. And I don't fully agree with the essay. There are certain parts that, I think we'll get to and I'd like to criticize and whatnot. But I think this question of like, why isn't there more impact is a serious one that I think like more Popperians/Deutschians need to wrestle with. And that's sort of why I wanted to have you on. I think I still lean closer to the cultural arguments. But anyway, we'll get there in due time. So with that, overly long intro, maybe I'll just have you actually set up your piece and maybe talk a bit about why you wrote it, what your main thesis or theses are, and then we can go from there.
Yeah. Thanks for all of that. Let's see, where do I start? So, I wrote the piece. I'll give a little, like a brief context for because I'm going to assume most people have not read the piece. As I was saying earlier, I got into Deutsch a few years ago. Got like I would say like really into the philosophy, and I would argue I did understand it like reasonably well. I mean, and we're gonna get. I think this is going to be an interesting topic of like who of Popper's critics like truly understood him. But anyway, I guess I want to mention that because I think I did see at the time, and I still do see a lot of criticisms of Deutsch that I think don't genuinely try to like take his view seriously and sort of shut it out before even considering, like before really like contemplating the idea that like, we're all fallible or all knowledge is conjectural, things like that. So anyway, I was really into it. And then there were certain kinds of like subtle contradictions within it that I intuitively maybe felt, but that I couldn't really verbalize and articulate. And then over the course of another few years, as I learned more about philosophy and had a lot of conversations with different people, listened to a lot of like podcasts with you guys, with Jake Orthwine, Christopher Lovegren. I started to, and then all the David Chapman stuff. I started to be like, okay, I think I have a clearer sense of like what's missing in this worldview. And then, and that essay was my attempt at articulating that. I actually, on the whole, don't think like I'm proud of the essay, but I don't think it was a great essay in the sense that it like basically it's like I actually think this is a very difficult problem. I mean, obviously, like the questions of knowledge and all these philosophical problems, I think, are hard, and articulating a clear answer to them is hard. And I think I guess what I'm trying to say is that like I still don't feel like I have like the answer of like this is like critical rationalism is wrong for X reason. I wouldn't even go as far as saying like critical rationalism is like fundamentally wrong. I think basically nowadays I view it more as like one interesting and useful way of thinking about knowledge and thinking about the world, and not the correct epistemology. I think that's where I probably diverge from a lot of critical rationalists. Yeah, and so there's this question of, you know, why hasn't critical rationalism had, you know, as much impact as maybe certain other movements like the EA rationalists? And I think that like I think an interesting question is like, why aren't more like, I think the rationalists are an example of a community that are very like epistemically humble, very curious, and try to think about things clearly. And like, why haven't more of them been converted to, you know, considering themselves critical rationalists? Like, I think that's one way of asking this question. And I do think that basically there are certain flaws either within the philosophy or within the way people talk about the philosophy that make it harder to like convince people and make it a less useful set of ideas, basically.
Yeah, just like before maybe I respond to Ben's question, I think it would be useful just to quote one of the major intro paragraphs of the essay for the listener so that they have just kind of an understanding of, let's say, the tone of the essay and the strength of the claims. Because there's going to be a bit of a disjunction, I think, between the writer's voice, as written there, and the soft, I don't know if I like or totally stand by a lot of the things I wrote in this essay. So I just think it's useful context. So here's the last paragraph of the intro that you wrote. So by nature of Deutsch and Popper's ideas being abstract, this essay will also necessarily be abstract. To combat this, let me ground the whole essay in a concrete empirical bet. Popper's ideas about epistemology and David Deutsch's extension of them will forever remain in the footnotes of the history of philosophy. Popper's falsificationism, which was the main idea he's widely known for, will continue to remain the only thing that he's widely known for. The frustrating fact that Wittgenstein is widely regarded as a more influential philosopher than Popper will continue to remain true. Critical rationalism will never be widely recognized as one correct epistemology, as the actual explanation or even the precursor to an explanation of knowledge, progress, and creativity. Instead, it will be viewed, like many philosophical schools before it, as a useful and ambitious project that ultimately failed. In other words, critical rationalism is a kind of philosophical dead end, the Deutschian Dead-end. So that paragraph, I think, is necessary context for Ben's question, which is the lack of impact, or that's part of what we're going to be discussing. But maybe I'm just curious, do you still hold to that, or has your mind changed on that paragraph? Because I don't want to attack a straw man, and also I know that after I've written something, my mind continues to change. And so if you have a different position now than you had in that essay, then we should make sure to be talking about your most recent position.
I think the one aspect I would maybe change is what I said about like the footnotes in the history of philosophy. I think even calling, like, it's like, is Popper a footnote in the history? I said history of philosophy. It's like, is Popper a footnote even right now? Is he a footnote in the history of philosophy, or was he, you know, a pretty major figure? And I think, you know, most people would say he was a pretty major figure. And I would maybe change it as like a footnote in the history of like culture as a whole. Like, it's like, I think the way a lot of critical rationalists frame, or at least how I used to think about Popper and Deutsch, is that like they discovered something that will eventually be recognized as like truly foundational idea for how humans work and how everything like works, like a very sort of pivotal understanding of reality, in the way that Darwin, like, for example, I think Darwin is seen as like a foundational figure in biology. I don't think that Popper will be, I don't think today Popper is seen as as widely seen as the Darwin of philosophy, and I don't think he will be. And I don't think he should be either. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the reason he's not is not because of some incidental thing about our culture. It's more problems within the philosophy itself. But yeah, I think the rest of the essay, like I still think that, yeah, falsifiability was like Popper's most, again, useful or interesting idea. And yeah, I think the rest of it, I pretty much agree with still.
Yeah, maybe I'll just kind of state my position. I think the point of this conversation is less to have like a debate and more just to explore some of these ideas. So I'll just maybe briefly respond to what Ben said. and then we'll maybe just start exploring stuff. Which is, I would take, I think you gave a number of possible responses, Ben, one of which is that you're just wrong, and I would take that position with maybe the caveat that I want to distinguish between like Karl Popper's writing and the online movement of critical rationalists, because to me, those are unbelievably distinct and separate things. So if you're talking about like influence and Popper's influence, like even if all he did was falsification, that would be enough to have tremendous influence, because that is just taught now as part of the scientific method. Like if you go on Wikipedia, like scientific method, in the same way that like you don't learn about quantum mechanics by jumping right into the details, you start by like a simplified solar system model of like stuff. The scientific method of like make a hypothesis and experiment and then look at your results and then try to refute your hypothesis. That is kind of like the simplified solar system model of how science works. And that is very important compared to make a hypothesis and then check that you're right. So even if it was just that, that would be massively influential, I think. But it's not just that. One of the things that I like about Popper's work and critical rationalism is that you don't need to take on the identity of a critical rationalist to adopt these ideas. So if someone like Peter Medwar reads a lot of Popper and gets influenced by Popper, and then goes on to figure out how to do like, I think one of his big contributions in biology was with regards to like skin grafting. I think he got a Nobel Prize for this. He doesn't identify and shout from the rooftops that he's a critical rationalist during his Nobel Prize speech, but he does in his writings credit Popper for a lot of his influences. Same with Paul Meehl. Again, doesn't say as a critical rationalist, I believe X, but he made significant contributions to psychology. And if you read enough of his stuff, you can read kind of in some spots that he was very influenced by Popper. Finally, John Eccles, who also won a Nobel Prize, as one of the people who made fundamental insights into how neurons transmit stuff. One theory was it was all about electricity, and the other theory is about like neurotransmitters. And John Eccles has a beautiful page and a half directly attributing his contributions to Popper. But these people aren't taking on critical rationalism as an identity and then waging war on Twitter/X every day. They're just influenced by these ideas, and they shut up about their origins because now they just think about John Eccles and Paul Meehl. The last thing I'll say is someone asked something about this with regards to Freud, and they're like, well, what has Freud ever done? Most of his ideas were about like oral fixations and wanting to bang your mom and et cetera, et cetera. And then Paul Bloom made the point, well, the whole notion of the unconscious came from Freud, but it's just so widely adopted now and so widely understood and built into the fabric of how we think about stuff that we don't really attribute it to Freud anymore. So we don't attach this idea of the unconscious to Freud. And I would say so many ideas that are in our culture can be traced back to Popper. And so that's why I disagree with the premise that he hasn't had cultural influence. If you want to count Nobel Prizes, I can point you to some names and you can trace the lineage. If you want to talk about quantum computation, the selfish gene, Dawkins was influenced by Medwar, who was influenced by Popper. So you can play this game of influence. And I think that's how we should think about it, because ideas don't have to form identities. And I think that a lot of the stuff, Kasra, that you're responding to is the online identity component, the annoying Twitter warrior component. And the question is, why isn't this little burgeoning movement of people who have read a few pages of Popper and then put it into their bio and then change their whole identity? How come these people aren't changing the world? Well, it's because these people are the ones who aren't doing active research. And the ones who are doing active research aren't on Twitter and thus aren't talking about how sick critical rationalism is. And so I would disagree with the premise for those reasons. And maybe we would disagree there, but I would just want to summarize, form a sharp distinction between online, Twitter, critical rationalism as a movement, as an identity, and people who just are influenced by it and then shut the hell up and then get to work doing biology and quantum computers and finance and this, that, and the other thing. Brian Boyd, another example.
There's two things here. So, and first of all, I'm still a big fan of both Popper and Deutsch, and think they were both are and will be very influential. But I think that's a given. I've kind of given that caveat already. So there's I think you're right that, a lot of the essay was kind of critiquing, behaviors of sort of maybe certain vocal critical rationalists online. And it's anyone can latch on to some ideology and maybe misrepresent it and not be an effective proponent of it. Mm-hmm. The examples that you gave, I think one question I have is you mentioned scientists who have won Nobel Prizes and who were influenced by Popper. I'm curious about the extent to which you would say that they fully understood Popper. I think, because I think we do make this somewhat binary distinction between people who actually get it and people who actually don't. I think most critical rationalists would agree. Obviously, no one fully we're all fallible, but there are some people who've fully gotten it and claim that they've really gotten it, and then there's a whole group of people who have not gotten it. And maybe the claim I would make is that in some of these cases, these scientists have been, you could say, influenced by Popper. And I do think there are a few principles in critical rationalism that are great, like fallibilism. We're all fallible. Being willing to question any piece of your knowledge, not saying there's anything that for absolute certainty, et cetera, et cetera. Not taking anything purely on authority. These are very useful principles. And yeah, I guess I'm not actually really sure, who the originator of fallibilism was, whether it was Popper or sort of was a mix of people, but
you could say Socrates, but Popper named it.
Yeah, I see. I would say that, those have had a big influence, but then this full-fledged philosophy that Popper, I think, put out I'm not sure that you could say that is the reason why, certain scientists were successful in their work.
I have a quote for you. Can I read you a quote?
Yeah.
I was anticipating this question. So this quote comes from John Eccles, and I'll just read a paragraph. At the time, I had learned from Popper that it was not scientifically disgraceful to have one's hypothesis falsified. That was the best news I had had for a long time. I was persuaded by Popper, in fact, to formulate my electrical hypothesis of excitatory and inhibitory synaptic transmissions. Okay, I'm just going to say that whole thing again. I was persuaded by Popper, in fact, to formulate my electrical hypothesis, technical word, blah, 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 so precisely and rigorously that they invited falsification. And in fact, that is what happened to them a few years later, very largely by my colleagues and myself, when in 1951 we started to do something, period. So I'll just finish the quote and then say a little bit more. Thanks to my tutelage by Popper, I was able to accept joyfully this death of my brainchild, which I had nurtured for nearly 2 decades. And I was immediately able to contribute as much as I could to the chemical transmission story, which was so-and-so's brainchild. Okay, so a little bit of context. John Eccles, for 20 years, was pushing forth the electrical hypothesis for how neurons communicate with each other. That was his baby, and that was what he was fighting for. But he gives, and this is just one paragraph of a 2-page thing, where he talks about how, after reading Popper and realizing that falsification isn't just falsify your ideas, man. It's taking an approach to your own ideas to try to make them so sharply precise that they are falsifiable and working towards killing your own favorite ideas. That is beyond just what you learn from high school, what falsification is. It's a whole approach to science. It's joyfully trying to kill your children, your brainchild. And this is what got him a Nobel Prize, because he got a Nobel Prize for his experiments that killed his own idea and then provided support for the chemical transmission story instead. So yes, I would say absolutely that John Eccles has deeply understood and been influenced by Popper, because they co-wrote a book together, which you can see on my shelf somewhere. And yeah, so it's not just cheap, and it's also not something that people do naturally. The tendency for most scientists at the time and most scientists today is to defend to the hilt their pet theory, their pet idea, and not want to joyfully see it executed. And that is what is so difficult about science. But that is one thing that one learns from Popper and what directly led to the Nobel Prize from John Eccles. And so that was one example, but I could also quote Brian Boyd, who wrote a brilliant book about the evolutionary origins of art. And I think Ben would sign off on the fact that Boyd understands Popper's work very well. And whether or not he has Popper cited in every single sentence is irrelevant, because he was able to make a contribution and he was obviously informed by Popper's work. And so too with Peter Medawar. So yes, I would say that the Nobel Prize winners and the big influencers who are not on Twitter deeply do understand Popper's work and his ideas, and that's why they were able to be so impactful.
But Vaden, you sort of told on yourself there when you said most scientists don't buy Popperianism and that they defend their own theses to the hilt, right? The question is not, have there been a couple people throughout history that have adopted and understood Popperianism and have they had impact? It would be astonishing, in fact, if you couldn't point to anyone who was influenced by Popper. I guess the question is, why is his influence not bigger? Right? Like, why do most modern philosophers kind of discount him? Why is he most people sort of adopt Popperianism and then say, but he was naive or he got a lot of stuff wrong. Or like, if you ask most practicing scientists, like, are you a Popperian? Most of them will say no. And the question is, why is that?
So just to clarify, so I didn't say that most scientists don't buy Popperianism. What I said was that most scientists aren't aware of Popper, and the natural thing to do if you haven't read Popper is to defend your own ideas, not try to critique them. So it's just a lack of familiarity or awareness with the ideas beyond just Popper, falsification guy, et cetera, et cetera. Why haven't there been more people? Well, it's bad etiquette to answer a question with a question, but just briefly, what would impact look like if not multiple Nobel Prize winners? No one can influence everybody. And like, what do you guys want? Just give me what impact would look like so I know what the criteria that you're trying to satisfy.
So, I mean, that's one direction. I guess I had a few thoughts that I don't know if they will make the conversation more or less productive, but so one thing that you mentioned is, like something we learned from Popper is that we should be trying to like kill our own ideas, basically. Mm-hmm. And that, like a lot of like certain successful scientists have done this. I guess like what I would say is that I don't know that this is like one element of being a scientist, but again, I haven't done a whole much science myself, but I'm sure there is also an element of, fighting for your ideas, like mm-hmm. sort of, believing in the seed of an idea enough that you keep pursuing it, and you don't want to kill it too early, basically, right? Yeah, and I think that it's like, Popper, this maxim of we should kill our ideas, like yes, but when should you kill it, right? When should you give up? There are scientists who I forget, I think it was like the guy who came up with the tectonic idea of tectonic plates. Mm-hmm. Like during his lifetime, he was basically like ridiculed. And I mean, I'm sure there are tons of examples of this where it's like no one believed him. And I don't know whether he personally gave up on that idea, but later, like a generation later, they were like, oh, that was actually the right idea. And so, you could argue that, there are many situations where you shouldn't be trying to like kill your ideas. And this is where maybe like a meta point here is like, any one piece of advice or any one, philosophical maxim on this is like, what I'm always interested in is like, how useful is it? Or, how much does this actually guide day-to-day behavior? So that's, mm-hmm. That's one. And one other comment I want to make is like, it might be helpful for us to sort of partition Popper's philosophy into different parts. Like, mm-hmm. I've mentioned that there are principles that I agree with, like, fallibilism and being critical of your ideas, and being critical of others' ideas. Maybe one, like, so it's like that for me is great. And I still stand by it. But then there are other things like, I think his claim that like, we know, or at least I see Deutsch kind of say this, that we know nothing to be true. We have no reason to believe that any of our theories are true or likely to be true, at all. And that, all our theories are basically like, sort of like completely like the idea of verification is like just complete nonsense, basically. That's my current understanding of what they say. So like, I don't know, we could kind of go into that as well as like the areas where I actually think, Popper is like mm-hmm. very much wrong. I don't know.
Okay. I have so many things to respond to, but just briefly. So like, just paint me a quick picture of what a world would look like where everyone agrees that Popper's ideas have impact, just so I know what the goal is here. Like, would you say that Socrates' ideas have had impact? And if so, how do you measure that?
Would it be helpful if I said like Popper had the position of like the way that Darwin is viewed in biology.
Sure.
That Popper has that position among us in the field of science as a whole.
I think I could maybe flesh this out a tiny bit in Kasra and then tell me if you agree or disagree. Which, I think there are maybe two ways to answer this question. One is to say, success, I think, would look something like most philosophers of science agreeing that we shouldn't try and do something like justify induction, right? Popper spilled a lot of ink arguing against induction, and yet there's still like a huge swath of people arguing about like, okay, how do we justify probabilistic efforts of induction? Is this problem induction still a thing, et cetera, right? And so I know this is all baked in like certain appeals to authority, and like, there are ways in which, of course, a current culture can just be totally wrong about its direction, right? But I think it's somewhat telling that, tons of philosophers either don't buy what Popper wrote outright or just think he sort of missed the boat and was like a little bit naive on his view, right? So I think it would look like more trying to build off, like it would look like current philosophy departments trying to build off of what Popper had done and recognizing that he was right about a lot of this stuff and then saying, okay, yes, and where do we go from here? As opposed to being like, Popper got a lot of this stuff wrong. We have to keep arguing about induction. We have to keep arguing about all this stuff that Popper thought he shut the door to. And then I also just want to mention, like, I think it's good that you're trying to separate Popper's influence as a philosopher from sort of this broader, very much online, critical rationalist oriented Twitter/X community. But I think there's still an interesting question to ask there, which is, there's a lot of people, us included, claiming that Popper had more like insights above and beyond the philosophy of science, right? He had insights into politics and democracy and just progress in general, how to make, exciting, fast progress in general. And we would claim that these sorts of insights, apply more widely than just in the lab when you're running a biology experiment. And there's a lot of people who, claim to be sort of influenced by these ideas online. And so I do kind of want to ask, like, where's the impact there? Like what's going on here? And again, there's multiple answers to that. You just argue it's too young, it's early days, there has been impact, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, so one, you're right to separate these two questions, but I think it's still interesting and fruitful to ask, like, of this online community, what's going on there? Like, why haven't they had the same sort of impact as EA and stuff?
Yeah, nice. Let me just respond briefly, and then we should definitely move on to maybe more specific level criticisms. But okay, so yeah, totally makes sense to me. The question, like, why don't all philosophers agree that Popper is the Darwin of epistemology?
It doesn't have to be all. I mean, I think that's a bit of none of us are going to expect that it's all, but like,
however people hold up Darwin or Turing or Einstein, why don't people do that with Popper with regards to epistemology? That's like the claim. Yeah. I would say that it's less easy to directly attribute impact to individuals in the same way that you can do that with like Edison and the light bulb. And I would make more of the comparison to literature. So why don't all writers agree that Nabokov is the most important writer, or Joyce, or Wordsworth is the most important poet, or like amongst certain fields, all you can kind of do is gather like a circle of highly impactful people. And then depending on who you're influenced by, you're obviously going to have certain preferences in terms of who you consider to be the most important writer, because philosophy is squishier than science. It's closer to a literature in that sense. And like when we talked to Boyd, he was very careful to say with regards to Nabokov that he's at least among the most important writers of the 20th century. That was about as far as he could go. And I think that, like, find me any philosopher that has that status. Even like people will say this about Socrates, and then other people will say, well, Socrates, like, what did he say? Like something, know that you don't know anything, something. Like, there doesn't exist any philosopher that has that position, I would argue. Every philosopher has their big fans, and the big fans of this philosophy think that their philosopher is the most important one. But it's you can't get neutral people to all agree that Popper solved epistemology in the same way that Edison did the light bulb. So I would just add that detail, which is that if you think of philosophy closer to literature than science with regards to the impact question, I think that's probably the right way to think about it.
I guess a question I have there is like, it feels like it seems strange to pin philosophy as being, like literature in a Popperian world view, I guess. Like, it's like, if philosophy is our attempt at understanding, how we obtain knowledge, and it's crucial to understand, and it's an indispensable tool for our own understanding of how we create knowledge. Why would it be squishy? Like, I personally do think that, like, philosophy does have this squishiness. Like, I talk about it as, philosophy, it operates at a very high level of abstraction, and that makes it very difficult to, attribute causality. It's like, does this person's philosophical belief, how is it influencing their actions? I mean, that is one of my critiques of philosophy as a discipline, which maybe we can sort of get into.
Yeah, just to substantiate that comment a bit, I'm more thinking about like the sociology aspect of it, like who are people's favorite philosophers is similar to who are people's favorite writers and less similar to who are people's favorite scientists. And the mechanics of that, I think, is pretty direct in the sense that you can use a computer and then be like, oh, this Turing guy was pretty sweet. But for philosophy, you have to read like 7 or 8 or 10 books. That's like a 2 or 3 year commitment to like understand this person's worldview. And so just the buy-in that's required kind of dictates that you get obsessed with an individual. So like we just did an episode on Kant. There's no way I can read all of Kant's work. But people who go all in on Kant have to spend 5, 6, 7, 8 years reading the vast majority of Kant's work. And then are going to be influenced by him. And then are going to talk about Kant being very impactful. And so that's what I meant when I was comparing it to literature. Just the amount of stuff you have to read is kind of what I meant there.
Yeah, okay. I'm a little wary. I have a response there, but I'm a little wary about dwelling on this particular point for too long. I mean, I think, so I asked this provocative question in the beginning. I think you've given a decent defense of namely, of what I would have called like the first option for pushback, basically, which is just argue that the premise is wrong. So we'll just, I guess, leave that on the table and people can sort of make up their minds. Mm-hmm. So now maybe let's move slightly more into the meat of Kasra's essay. And maybe I'll just start with one of my concerns / criticisms, which was that you made a choice in the essay to bundle multiple people together. So in particular, you're talking about Popper and Deutsch most prominently, but then you're also talking about some modern people who are followers largely of David Deutsch. So I think Brett Hall is maybe the most prominent person who sort of comes up in your essay. So this is like, there's sort of 3 people's worldviews in some sense.
I think Chiara Mileto was in there as well. Yeah, I think just to be clear, okay, Popper, nice. Deutsch, Brett Hall, and Chiara Mileto were the 4.
Nice. Okay. So I think from a certain 30,000 foot view, this makes sense, right? But I think, in the essay, there are times when you're making fairly specific claims about what X or Y thought, and you might be right about one of them at some point, but then it's not true of another thinker. And I think if someone's not familiar with all of these thinkers, they can come away with your essay thinking that these people all thought the same thing, and it's just sort of this monolith. And Deutsch said this thing here, and therefore Popper must be wrong about it too. But I think there are like points in your essay where I'd just say, actually, Popper and Deutsch just disagreed about this. Like for like ladder of abstractions, for instance, like Popper and Deutsch treat abstractions very differently. And same with your ambiguity section. So I think you actually made some super nice points criticizing what, Deutsch's approach and sort of people who are currently influenced by Deutsch and their approach to ambiguity. But I think Popper sort of solved this problem. And, we can point people to Vane and I's episode on David Chapman if they want to be open to being convinced on that point. But yeah, I guess I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about like why you chose to bundle sort of these people together and present the essay that way, as opposed to focusing on just Popper or just Deutsch or... Yeah.
It's probably not going to be a very satisfying answer, but it was kind of incidental. So this essay, like I had been wanting to write something like this for a long time. And I've written sort of questions about critical rationalism in the past. But yeah, what sparked it more recently was reading some of Chiara Marletto's book and being like, oh, like this paragraph is like, for me, a very good encapsulation of what I think critical rationalism is missing. And so, that was one of the first quotes in the essay is from her book. I've contemplated like basically rewriting that essay, but with taking quotes from like Deutsch, primarily Deutsch. Basically, I think the most substantive points in the essay are, it's not clear to me that it's about like, Popper and Deutsch disagree, and so I'm only criticizing one of them. Basically, maybe we can go into those in a bit more detail. It was a very incidental reason that I quoted one versus the other, but my sense is that a lot of them would apply to all, like both Popper and Deutsch.
Okay, so let's maybe start with the section about observation being theory-laden. People who listen to Vaden and I talk a lot will be very familiar with this phrase, that observation is theory-laden. This was a phrase that originated with Popper, I think, but he was very influenced by Kant on this point. And the idea is that we don't directly perceive reality. It's always mediated by our brains. Because it's mediated by our brains, it's mediated by certain expectations that we have. And we have theories about how the world works, and that influences how we perceive reality. So you take issue with this view in some sense. And I think, I'm in an interesting spot with this because I think you push back too hard on this view. And so I wouldn't agree with where you land. I would disagree with also a lot of modern Deutschians when they use this phrase, because I think they sort of take it too far. So Vane and I got in a tactful scruffle, I would describe it, with David Deutsch when he came on the podcast talking about the value of stuff like data science. And so both Vaden and I, Vaden more so, but we both spent a lot of time just looking at data and writing code and stuff. And every data scientist know that you look at your data. That's like the first thing you do is if you have some project, right, and you have data and you want to do something with the data, you look at the data first, and the data can often give you ideas about what to do or what problem you're going to solve next, or how, what procedure you need to do to answer whatever question you have. This doesn't contradict Popper in my mind. Popper was talking to a much lower level of abstraction in some sense here, like even just like looking at the screen, what you're expecting to see when you look at the screen, when you're looking at the data and what you expect to see there, what the numbers represent, that's all still mediated by your brain and theories and stuff. But this isn't to say that looking at things and observing things can't give you ideas. And I would say a lot of like online Popperians now would be pretty allergic to making that sort of concession. And so I agree that a lot of people take this too far, but I sort of disagree with you that we can sort of get to this place of pure experience, which, correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but I think you kind of want to go there, where there are like realms where we sort of do just directly access the world. So maybe just talk a bit about your thoughts in that section of what you were trying to say.
Yeah. So I think maybe the part where I diverge most from Deutsch is like when it gets to theory of mind, basically. I think a big question when we say observation is theory laden is like being clear about what a theory is and what kinds of theories there are. So yeah, again, like, when you read out a temperature in an experiment, there are theories about underpinning the structure of that, of your thermometer or whatever. And then like, the idea of Celsius is, entails some theories. Yeah. When you are experiencing a feeling, or you're just kind of like, looking out at the world, there is there's like this field of conscious experiences. And I think like, and again, there are ideas there. Like, yes, I might, I look at a plant, and if I have an emotional attachment to it because my mom gave me that kind of plant or something, that will color my experience. But there is, again, a component of it where it's just like, there is a conscious experience there. And it's not, I think saying that it's mediated by theory I think is missing something. There's a sense in which the experience is manifest, is the way I put it in the essay. And then when we try to analyze the experience, and when we try to turn that experience into like a verbal report, there's all kinds of theories that, play into our ability to do that. But I guess, what I want to say is that like the experience itself is sort of this like pure thing that's just there.
but the experience is different than the underlying reality.
Yes, yeah,
Do
like
you agree?
it's
There?
you're not. Yeah, the experience is not giving you some kind of pure access to reality. And another way, another way I would say is that your experience, like your experience, like your presence of the experience is part of reality, right? It's like right. And so in that sense, like you have direct access to reality, but like whatever it was out there that generated the experience, obviously you don't have access to that.
Yeah, well, so I think you're slightly equivocating on the word reality. So there's the reality of feeling pain, and then there's the let's call that like subjective reality. And everyone agrees you have direct experience of experience. Of course, yes, you do. But what Popper's talking about is not that. He's talking about the reality outside of your experience, and specifically what he's pushing back against is the idea that experience equals reality, which is was the dominant view at the time. And to quote this section, so you say, there are many things you can directly observe and which are manifestly true to you. What you're wearing at the moment, what room of the house you're in, whether the sun is set, whether you're running out of breath, whether your parents are alive, whether you feel a piercing pain in your back, whether you feel warmth in your palms. These are not perfectly certain absolute truths about reality, and there is always more to know about them, but I think it's silly to claim that we have absolutely no claim on their truth either. I also think that there are even such obvious truths in the realm of science, like the claim that the Earth is not flat, that your body is made of cells, and that everyday objects follow predictable laws of motion. So I have a number of responses to this. The first, to take it in reverse order, I mean, we discovered cells in like the 1700s, right? Like that was a thing that was not obvious up until Robert Hooke got in a little microscope and was able to see them. So if it was an obvious truth, then there would have been no discovery period in the 1700s. I think the idea that we thought the Earth was flat a long time ago in the past, I think that's not true. I think there's reasons to believe that we always thought the Earth was round. But just to use the cell example, like it is not obvious. If you see your hand, you do not see little cells. The direct experience is not cells, right? And the big insight from Popper and from the idea that truth is always theory-laden is what you say here, which is these are not perfectly certain absolute truths about reality. So like when Popper says that you could be wrong about the fact that I have a wedding ring on my left hand, all he means to say is that you can't have perfect certainty there, which you grant. But Popper and Deutsch do not think that we have absolutely no claim on their truth. The whole notion of truth and having claims on truth is baked into the idea of best explanation, which is like a cliche now. But to talk about a best explanation is to talk about, out of a set of many explanations, we think that this one is closer to truth. The whole verisimilitude stuff is just limits on the ability to actually mathematize it and to measure it. But neither Popper nor Deutsch think we're just in this relativist abyss where every claim has no more certainty or truth associated with it than any other claim. There's clearly a hierarchy, and that's why we talk about best explanations. And we use concepts like ease with which something can be varied, parsimony, criticizability, empirical tests, all as heuristics, as ways to say that we believe that this idea is going to be much closer to truth than some other idea, but we can never be certain of it. And so I guess I read the section and I wasn't clear what your criticisms are, because it seems like you agree with the main insights of Popper and Deutsch. And so maybe just spell this out a little bit more, because this whole section was odd from my perspective.
What I noticed Deutsch saying a lot of the time is like, there's no such thing as like more sure. Like that, I think the thing, like I think there's something contradictory. Like there's something that appears contradictory about like critical rationalism, which is that it's like, we're fallible. Everything is a conjecture, right? Everything is sort of, in some sense, on like this even footing. And then, we have our best explanation, but we know that all our best explanations are all false, right? That's another thing that I feel like critical rationalists might say. But yeah, is that not like a fair representation?
I wouldn't say that we know that they're false.
Deutsch would. That's a difference between Deutsch and Popper.
So Popper has said somewhere that he thinks, and I think, that we could have hit upon perfect truth. We'll just never be certain of it. Like, I'm pretty sure that the periodic table is true. If I was to have to choose one set of ideas that I would say that one's true, I would probably put the periodic table up there. However, I can just never be perfectly certain of that. So we can have truth. We just will never be sure of it. If Deutsch disagrees with that, then I disagree with Deutsch.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think we mostly agree. It's probably a very subtle difference. But it sounds like you're saying we can become more sure of, as we develop more theories, we become more confident in like in the truth of our theories. I think if you agree with that, then I don't think there's much.
Yeah, I do. Maybe just it would be useful. I think Deutsch goes too far in trying to expunge all notions of belief and certainty and subjectivity from not only his writing, but his language and when he's speaking and stuff. And I think that it kind of just makes it a bit awkward to communicate. He would say we can't be more sure because he doesn't think you can put your beliefs on a sliding scale. But if you reframe it, you would say, well, can you have better or worse explanations? He'd be like, yeah, absolutely. Can you rank your explanations? Sure. Can you evaluate explanations based on a number of criteria and have one explanation remaining? When he speaks that way, I just map it into like confidence language because that's just a more natural way to speak. And I'm much more a Popperian than a Deutschian because Popper just draws a distinction between these things and says you can't use the probability calculus on it, but you can absolutely talk about being more or less sure about stuff, of course. He would talk about the problem situation as being relevant there, and we don't need to go into those details. But I think this is one of the places where you might get yourself in trouble by just lumping all these thinkers together and assuming they all share the same views, because they very much don't.
But I am wary of letting this criticism be diffused too easily. So I think you're talking to people who are particularly sympathetic to still having like a colloquial notion of certainty and degrees of belief and this sort of stuff. So and Vade and I have just we're allergic to overly mathematizing it, but I think, we'll still talk about we're more or less sure about some things. And like, it's a super natural and useful notion to be able to talk about confidence. Like, I'm very confident in one thing, very not confident about another thing. And I definitely don't want to delete that from our vocabulary or how we think about epistemology and stuff. But I think so you're talking to people who I think agree with you on this point, but I think Vaden might be being overly sympathetic to Deutsch here, because I think Deutsch does want to go most of the way towards like expunging these notions from discussions of epistemology. And in particular, I think, he basically doesn't really want to talk about belief and degrees of belief and this sort of stuff. And I know he has a coherent way to map this back to talking about explanations, but people wield this as a cudgel unthinkingly to like defend certain theories that we're just totally unsure about. So, like people will just talk about the best explanation of the brain being that we're universal explainers. And they'll talk about this with the same level of confidence that they'll talk about the theory of evolution,
the Earth being not flat.
Yeah, stuff like this. And then they'll use this as a cudgel in conversation to basically just like shut down competing theories from my perspective. And, now I'm talking about particular people and not necessarily Deutsch, but there is a way in which this idea of being allergic to like levels of confidence and Kasra, you kind of call this like the hierarchy of reliability. There is a way this is, used in conversation in totally unhealthy and unhelpful ways, I think.
Can I make two comments before, Kasra, you respond? Mm-hmm. One is that, I agree, yes, the Deutsch does try to get rid of notions of subjectivity and expunge it, but the reason it's so difficult for him is that he doesn't want to do the thing that Kasra is saying he does do, which is that we have no claim on truth and that everything is all relative. Like, the reason why it's so difficult for him to do this is precisely because he's trying to get rid of subjectivity while preserving notions of truth.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I think that's an area, Kasra, where you were misunderstanding Deutsch and critical rationalism, because at no point do us crit rats ever talk about having no claim to truth. That's just relativism. And Deutsch is as against relativism as we are.
Yeah.
That's point number one. Point number two is that I think we need to be very careful not to make the mistake of saying, well, the eugenicists have taken Darwin's ideas and done some pretty stupid things with them, thus Darwin's an idiot. But we are kind of doing that with Deutsch, right? Where we're saying, well, there's a lot of people who've taken Deutsch's ideas, use that as a cudgel, and are doing some stupid things with it, thus Deutsch must be wrong, right? The way that people act upon learning a philosophy and getting these ideas in their head is obviously influenced by the philosophy, but just like we don't get rid of Darwinian natural selection because of the eugenicists and the Nazis, we should be careful not to assume that people's actions and the way that people interpret these ideas are equivalent to those ideas. And that's, I think, is also a place where the essay does make that mistake, I would say.
I don't think we're doing the equivalent of the eugenicists with Darwin's theory or with Deutsch. Like here, we're just taking an explicit part of the philosophy and looking at the consequences of reasoning that way, right? If you start getting rid of notions of confidence and stuff, what happens? And I'm saying now, you get all these theories on an even playing field, and there's no ways to start distinguishing between levels of confidence in them and stuff. And I just think that does harmful things to public conversation.
You're referring to the actions and behaviors of people who are using concepts like truth is not manifest, all observations are theory-laden as cudgels, right? I think the main thing was the cudgeling component, shutting down conversation,
sure,
using those slogans all over,
or just getting confused about what we know and what we don't know. I would argue it's just inappropriate to be as sure about the theory of universal explainers as we are about evolution or the Earth being round or anything.
I totally agree. I'm only making the point that because people take certain ideas and go act in ways or take them to places that the author of the idea didn't intend, you should just be careful not to impugn the author necessarily because of the way that the adherents are building off of those ideas. And the comparison between eugenicists and Darwin is only to say that we all recognize that there is some relationship between Darwinism and eugenics. However, the fact that we are critical of eugenics does not mean that we also need to say that Darwin was a dead end, right? And I just want to make a distinction between the progenitor of said ideas and the way that they act and what those ideas are.
I'm just okay. Forget that then. If you don't like that language, I'm just saying the object level claim that we don't have degrees of certainty is just unhelpful and wrong. Forget actions, forget cudgels. I just think it's a sort of a fool's errand to not talk about having confidence in various theories.
To me, it seems like critical rationalism is opposed to the idea of, asserting that we have evidence for a theory or that we can't confirm a theory or that are more sure of one theory or another.
So Bruce has a nice podcast on this. I'll find the show notes. Basically, there's a way to map any falsification into the language of verification and vice versa. So if you conjecture, use the same example, that all swans are white, and then you see another white swan, you could describe that white swan as a potential experiment that has resisted falsification, because if it was a black swan, it would falsify your idea. And thus, the theory has withstood another round of falsification, and so we should have more confidence in it. Popper doesn't shy away from the confidence language as much. So just in that silly example, I know it's a little bit arcane, but you could describe a verification event via the lens of falsification and vice versa. The reason this is important, though, is that if you recognize that the scientific enterprise is about falsifications, then you will set up different kinds of experiments. So verification happens via falsification. And that is why there is equivalence here, but it really matters that you take one side of the equivalence, because that will determine the kinds of experiments that you run, and it will determine the cycle, like how happy you are to have your theory falsified, as the John Eccles quote talks about, right? So even though there's equivalence, it matters that you're on one side of the equivalence.
Also, just, one thing to inject here is or another way to reframe what Vaden's saying is, if you set up science as to verify things, you'll just set yourself up for paradox after paradox, right? So if you try and formalize the notion of verification, and then you ask, what would it take to verify things? Then you end up doing just totally uncritical tests of, it's very easy to verify things in other ways. And you can make this very formal with certain paradoxes and stuff. Right. But anyway, that's just another way to put some spin on what Vaden was saying. Yeah.
I see. It matters that you focus more on falsifying than on verifying.
Yeah.
I guess a question I have is does repeated verifications of a theory, does that tell us anything? If we have a theory that we've done 100 experiments on it and we found, does it tell us anything at all?
Yeah, well, it depends. It depends if the theory could have been wrong according to the experiment, right?
Right.
That's what's crucial, right? So if you want to set up the experiment in such a way such that there are different possible outcomes, and on hopefully all those outcomes but one, your theory will be shown to be wrong. And so if it resists many tests like that, and that's when our verisimilitude goes up. So Popper tried to talk in terms of corroboration and verisimilitude precisely because he didn't want to totally throw out the notion of confidence and stuff. And most people would agree these kind of ways to formalize it failed ultimately, but they at least show you that he was sensitive to this issue that of course we know, if something resists, like CERN, right? We're running all these massive particle collider experiments, and we're not trying to verify the standard model of particle physics. That would be extremely easy to do because it accords with every observation we're making. So in some sense, we're always verifying it, looking around. Everything we know about physics is verifying it. But we set up these giant, expensive CERN experiments precisely so that we try and disconfirm it, or we try and separate theories. We ask, okay, at high energies, I'm getting out of my depth here, but supersymmetry is going to predict one thing and X theory is going to predict another thing. And so, we run that test. And then if it resists, if it's resists falsification by multiple of those tests, in other words, it's being verified, then we can have more confidence in it. But again, so this is just all to say that the type of test matters.
Yeah. In that case, I think I had heard about verisimilitude, but I hadn't really read Popper's thinking on it. And I also knew that Popper talks about theories being corroborated by experiments, but that, my impression was that when Popper says, this theory was corroborated by this experiment, that doesn't make us, that's not reason for us to believe that the theory is more true. But it, it sounds like he does, at some point try to take that angle. And I think, then I would be that's closer to how I think about it. I don't think that, again, it's putting aside the idea of certainty, we're never certain. But when we do these experiments and we try and we, attempt to falsify our theories and we fail to falsify them, that does increase our confidence in some sense, not in an absolute mathematical way, but it does. And so, to the extent that Popper says that, then I would agree with Popper, and I'd want to update that. I guess I'm trying to figure out to what extent this was a misreading of Popper, because again, my understanding of his whole project was to, eliminate the idea of support, that experiments support a theory. But I guess, it sounds like that's just basically not true.
At the time he was talking, he was writing a lot against the logical positivists, right?
Right.
And so they were all about support, verify, something is true, the more tests you run, and if you run more and more tests, then you'll get to truth. And we have a much more nuanced understanding of this now. And so when Popper replaces words like verify with corroborate, he's not just being pedantic, he's trying to separate his treatment of this from the logical positivists. And one way is to use terminology to indicate that we're thinking about this differently. And one of the titles of his books is Realism and the Aim of Science. What is science aiming towards? It's aiming towards truth. It's aiming towards reality. But we can only ever talk about directionality, getting closer to it and getting further from it. And one way that you like, so we'll get into like the ladder of abstractions and stuff. Mm-hmm. But one thing that we can say with certainty is that we may not know if Einstein's theory is true, but it's certainly more true than Newton because it contains Newton. So if Einstein is false, then Newton has to be false. If Newton is false, Newton is false, and Einstein can still be true because there's areas of reality that Einstein can explain that Newton can't. So even in just that example, Newton and Einstein, we have baked into it the notion of more or less true, and greater and worse and closer to something and further from something, without having to talk about belief or certainty or verification. So much of the worldview is slightly nuanced precisely because Popper and Deutsch are avoiding relativism, which is why I just kind of objected to this idea that it's silly to claim we have absolutely no claim on truth either, because that's not what they're claiming. And that's why it's sometimes difficult to understand what they are saying, because it would just be so much easier to just make a relativist claim.
Yeah. Well, I guess the one thing I'm still not sure about is like, is Deutsch, it sounds like this is a thing that Deutsch and Popper disagree on, right? So like Deutsch actually tries to, discard any idea of verification, or does he not? Like, do Deutsch and Popper actually agree that, like, again, as we do these experiments, we get more corroborating evidence for a theory?
With regards to corroboration and distance to truth, they pretty much agree. Deutsch has a really nice paper on the logic of experimental tests, something like that. I think it's very much worth reading, where he addresses a lot of these issues. Where they strongly disagree is on the notion of like belief and certainty. I'll point you to a paragraph or a chapter in Objective Knowledge that I think is very well written. And Popper doesn't do away with the idea of certainty. He just makes the claim that certainty, there's no upper bound to it because it's always problem dependent and situational. So if I say to you, are you certain that you have, socks on your feet? You'd be like, yeah, what are you talking about? Of course I am. Then if I point a gun to my head and I say, I'm going to blow my brains out if you aren't absolutely sure about this, then you're going to be like, okay, well, maybe I'm going to check, right? And so the checking is this notion that as soon as the situation and the problem context changes, the amount of certainty you need changes relative to the stakes. The stakes are higher, then you need more certainty. And so what that means is that you can't put a measure on it and you can't talk about absolute distance to perfect certainty, because perfect certainty will always change depending on the context and the situation. Yeah. So Popper is much more nuanced because he's saying, certainty is a real thing, but it doesn't make sense to assign like a probability and put it between 0 and 1, because your 1 will change as soon as the stakes are different.
That's definitely like my Popper acknowledging certainty being a thing depending on the problem situation is like, definitely news to me. So I'll send you the 2 paragraphs or whatever where he talks about this. It's really nice.
The one caveat here is I'm not sure Deutsch, I think Vaden, you said Popper and Deutsch agree with respect to corroboration and stuff. I'm not entirely sure that's true. I've heard Deutsch say things like, Popper didn't believe in supporting arguments. He only believed in arguments that like disconfirm something, which I don't think this is true, but like I'm just saying this is indicative, I think, of how Deutsch thinks about things. And like I think he basically has discarded the ideas of like verisimilitude and stuff. Like he's never talked about that. So anyway, I'm out of my depth here in terms of speaking for Deutsch. Like I'm quite unsure what he thinks about this, but my sense is he's much more adversarial, or has a more adversarial relationship with these sorts of notions of corroboration and stuff than Popper did.
That's possible.
I'll leave it possible there. Yeah. Okay. So do we want to talk about hierarchy of reliability or ladder of abstractions, or do you kind of view these as intertwined?
I think I do actually. Yeah. So we could start with the hierarchy of reliability. I think that's going to be also related to this verification thing.
Yeah, cool. Do you want to maybe just give us an overview of the main thesis there, and then we'll push back as necessary?
Yeah, I think basically like what I do is there's like a line that Deutsch has in, I forget if it's Fabric of Reality or Beginning of Infinity, but he says that there's like the standard view that we are sure of mathematical theories and somewhat sure about scientific theories, and then philosophical theories are mostly matters of opinion, or matter of taste. And he says that this is, completely wrong. Like they're all sort of on, again, this even footing. That's how I interpret it. And I basically disagree with that. I think we basically are like more sure about mathematical and scientific theories than we are about philosophical theories. And that's by the nature of what I try to talk about in the essay, which is, what do I say? I guess it's like basically our methods of critiquing those theories are just more robust, right? It's like, so that's basically my view on it. And my impression was that Deutsch or maybe Popper disagree with that.
Yeah. Actually, I don't have too much to say here. I mean, what comes to mind is that, Popper liked to bucket theories into three different categories. The first was logical and mathematical. The second was empirical. And the third was philosophical or metaphysical. And the reason he categorized these differently is precisely, as you said, there's different notions of arguing about them. There's different notions of criticizing them. And with logical and mathematical theories, you do this with logic and with math. With empirical scientific theories, you do it with observation and experiment. And with philosophical and metaphysical theories, this is outside the realm of falsifiability, right? You can't set up an experiment to criticize them, to falsify them. Instead, you argue about them. And I think this actually tracks for me quite nicely with what you said, because it's easier to come up with logical arguments and empirical arguments than it is to come up with philosophical arguments that will convince everyone. And so I think I probably agree with you, and in fact would just point to the fact that we seem to make more progress in areas like math and science than we do in areas like philosophy. Of course, there's some exceptions you can point to, but on the whole, I think that's probably a reasonable presupposition to adopt. So, yeah, I think I largely agree with this. I actually don't know where Deutsch comes down on this. I mean, I think he would agree that there's different ways of criticizing these theories. I think he perhaps just wanted to take a stand against the a priori assumption that we're always less sure about philosophical theories than we are about mathematical theories, right? Like when a new mathematical theory comes along, we are not sure about it. Like when Wiles first presents his proof, we're not sure that he's right. And in fact, he was wrong. His first proof was wrong, right? And it took us a long time to go through it and for an expert mathematician to spot the mistake. And then it took him another year or two to fix his mistake. Whereas there are certain philosophical theories that I think we're all quite on board with.
Realism?
Solipsism? No, I don't want to say solipsism. Yeah, realism is a good example. Or solipsism. Yeah, there we go. I was like, what the hell's that word again? I was like, solipsism. What is going on here? So like ontological realism, or the fact that there are other conscious entities besides ourselves, right? That's difficult to prove empirically. And so I think he probably just wanted to push back against that. That assumption that we're always less sure about philosophy and always more sure about math. And I think that's equally incorrect. But like you said, the methods for criticizing these things differ. Yeah, that was a long-winded way to say I probably agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, what you said, Kasra, just makes you a Popperian. I have the chapter open, 266 of Conjectures and Refutations. He says basically exactly what you just said, and that's exactly right. Like,
wait, what does he say?
Page 266 of Conjectures and Refutations, he says, we may distinguish here between three types of theories. First, logical and mathematical theories. Second, empirical and scientific theories.
I see.
Third, philosophical or metaphysical theories. And then he goes on to say what Ben just said, which is that the distinction between them and the reason there is a hierarchy of reliability is the ease of criticism. So it's much easier to criticize a mathematical theory because you just look for a math error. You don't need to leave your office. You can just figure it out on paper. And then if it's immediately right or wrong. Scientific theories are more challenging, but you can run empirical experiments. And then philosophical theories are more challenging still because you have to use argument. But that doesn't mean you can't make progress on each of these. And there's your hierarchy, right? That's where the hierarchy lives. And the reason why Deutsch was pushing back against this is because people mistake this hierarchy by thinking we have absolute certainty at like the mathematical level, at least.
I guess, but like Deutsch to me is trying to get rid of any notion of hierarchy at all. Like, it's not just that he's not just trying to say we're not certain, like there is a hierarchy, but we're just not certain about it. I think he's like, there is no hierarchy.
Do you want to read the quote just to get the listeners on the same page? I think you had a nice quote.
Yeah. He says here, some philosophical arguments, including the argument against solipsism, are far more compelling than any scientific argument. Indeed, every scientific argument assumes the falsity not only of solipsism, but also of other philosophical theories, including any number of variants of solipsism that might contradict specific parts of the scientific argument. So, like here, what he's doing is he's saying that, all of our scientific arguments rest on a large number of our philosophical arguments, right? And so, if we want to say that science is like more robust, or the methods of criticism are more robust than philosophy, like the fact that science depends on philosophical arguments sort of just wipes that out, does it not?
Well, so can you also read the 2 paragraphs after that quote? Because I so strongly disagree with them, but maybe you should read them, and then just for the context for the audience.
Like the paragraphs from the book itself, or my?
No, I'm sorry. Yeah. So then you say there are 2 different mistakes happening here.
So first, there's 2 mistakes happening here. First, what Deutsch is doing is assuming a strict logical dependency between any one piece of our knowledge and any other piece of it. So he says that our knowledge of science implicitly relies on philosophical arguments about solipsism, epistemology, metaphysics. And then I say, anyone who has thought about the difference between philosophy and science recognizes that they're, studied and argued about independently. And obviously we can make progress on one without having to, question our assumptions about the other. I talk about, we can study neurons without solving the hard problem of consciousness. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, maybe. Yeah. So what Deutsch is doing is not assuming a strict logical dependency between any one of our pieces of knowledge and every other piece of it. It's not every piece is logically dependent on every other piece. Because in the paragraph you quote, it's some philosophical arguments, including the arguments against solipsism, are far more compelling than any scientific argument. And indeed, every scientific argument assumes the falsity of not only of solipsism, but of other philosophical theories, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a logical dependency between every philosophical theory and every scientific theory.
But so he says every scientific argument assumes the falsity of solipsism and other theories. Like, why? Why is that the case?
Because if the only thing that exists is your mind, then there are no necessary regularities in nature to be discovered, because those regularities are entirely constructed by you. If we're living in the Matrix, then there's no realism to be discovered, because all we'll ever see is what our mind creates. And so every scientific argument implicitly assumes the falsity of solipsism, because what they're aiming to discover is not their mind. It's to discover the reality. But that is not the case with determinism, say, or
causation or something.
Yeah, or causation. There's all sorts of philosophical arguments that are not...
Basically, solipsism is compatible with any scientific argument, I think. Like, solipsism is the view that, I'm the only conscious entity. Nobody else actually exists. It's all sort of appearances in my mind. And maybe they're like very complex and sophisticated appearances, but they're still just appearances in my mind, right? That is compatible. Like, you can't prove or disprove that using, some scientific argument. As far as I understand, Deutsch's like critique of solipsism is just that it's not a good explanation. It's taking realism, inverting it, adding a bunch of qualifications like, well, all these things appear to be coming from some objective external reality, but actually they're like technically part of my mind. But again, that's still not a refutation of like solipsism.
In the chapter of conjectures and refutations that I was citing, the whole thing is about the problem of the irrefutability of philosophical theories. So you're absolutely right that solipsism is irrefutable. And the question that Popper addresses in this chapter, I pointed to you not because we'll necessarily go into it too much here, but because I just think you'll find it interesting, is if philosophical theories are all irrefutable, how can we ever distinguish between true and false philosophical theories? Solipsism, we can say, is false. And the scientific argument we have for this is the ease with which it can be varied and the fact, basically the stuff that you already know. Can I say with certainty it's false? No. can I say that it is much more reasonable to assume it's false than the negation, to assume it's true? You have to make an assumption step. And based on sound arguments, there are many strong reasons to believe, and I can go into them if you like, that solipsism is false. And all scientists implicitly assume that.
I guess, like, why do you need to make an assumption about it in the course of doing, whatever?
Because it's irrefutable. The irrefutability of the theory necessitates an assumption either way.
I think that's what he's questioning. Like, why does it necessitate? Like, why couldn't you just do your daily practice of science?
Yeah, like
without taking a stance on it.
Well, if you would have to start taking stances like, okay, not only is the whole world made via my mind, but my mind also puts regularities in that world, and those regularities will not change when I go to sleep. And so you end up just making a solipsistic world that is equivalent to realism with extra unnecessary assumptions.
Basically, why do you need to take any position at all on solipsism as a philosophy when you're doing an experiment on, like a biology experiment, like when you're looking at cells in a microscope?
Well, so I don't think you have to be a practicing scientist, but the argument...
I guess maybe it's like I'm picking on the words here, but for me, when he says it assumes, every scientific argument assumes the falsity of solipsism and other philosophical theories, I guess I'm just not sure why he says that. And to me, like, that is where I read the sort of, he's assuming that, like, it's like we have to spell out all the possible implications of all of our theories.
Yeah, that's the other thing that this comes from Jake, that everything is logically dependent on everything else. And like, the whole point of putting explanations as primary is that you do not need logical entailment between everything. The fundamental difference between an explanation and a proof is that explanations do not have strict logical dependencies. That is a very key point because you're saying that Deutschian worldview assumes strict logical dependencies between every claim and every other claim, but it does not do that because it values, arguably fetishizes explanations, which are definitionally not proofs and don't assume strict logical dependencies between every clause and every other clause. So this, I know, comes from Jake and Chapman, but they're wrong about this. And you just need to think about the difference between an explanation and a proof.
But yeah. Well, I mean, but like the way we use explanations is we take their logical implications and then we test them, right? And we refute them using logic, right? As an explanation ultimately makes a bunch of statements and then we take those logical. So it's like, I guess I don't see what.
You don't always refute them using logic. Sometimes you do.
Like, any refutation involves identifying a contradiction between, whether it's between two statements within the theory or between a statement of the theory and some empirical result that we have.
Which is why Popper talks about the problem of irrefutable theories and how can you still say that they're false? Because you're right. A refutation requires logical contradictions. However, there's classes of theories that are irrefutable, but yet we can still make claims as to their truth or falsity.
Yeah, maybe just to clarify one thing here. I'm not quite sure you guys are arguing about the same thing, but just back to the scientific theories depend on taking certain philosophical theories for granted. I think you've successfully pointed out that solipsism.
Yeah, that's so funny. Yeah, solipsism. Yeah.
I think you've successfully pointed out that solipsism is not a good example here. You can imagine practicing scientists who, are maybe agnostic as to solipsism, but still practice science. I think maybe just a clearer example would be something like causation, or maybe the claim that the universe is not going to end in 5 minutes, right? Both of those are irrefutable, but you're taking one side of those issues for sure when you're doing any sort of experiment. The causation one is easy to see, right? You can't prove causation empirically.
I think there are fewer things you're taking a stance on than I think you're claiming. Like, I'm not claiming, like, when I do an experiment, I'm not implicitly. So, for example, like, you're saying that, when I do an experiment, I'm implicitly claiming that the world is not going to end in 5 minutes. And that also means I'm implicitly claiming the world is not going to end in 5 minutes and 1 second, and 5 minutes and 2 seconds, and so on and so forth. And so you're saying that just by doing any experiment, there are an infinite number of statements that I'm implicitly sort of refuting, or I'm assuming the falsity of. And I think, like, I guess what I'm saying is I don't think that that's a good way of, in some sense, yeah, but like that's not actually relevant to the process of doing science. And so in the same way, like when Deutsch says, like doing science assumes the falsity of solipsism, I'm saying that like solipsism is not even relevant to doing whatever experiment you're trying to do. And so you don't need to assume one way or another about it at all, basically.
Causation is, though.
So causation, like, again, it's somewhat depends on what exactly you mean by causation. Like, I could imagine there are scientists who might, have different philosophical ideas about causation, but be like engaging on an experiment together and like agreeing on what's happening in that experiment.
Sure, but if they had different ideas about what causation would say about the outcome of that experiment, then they'd be trying to resolve that before they did the experiment.
Right. But it's it's not always true that like causation is playing a role in every experiment that you're doing. Like basically it depends on the specific experiment.
Sure, it has a bearing on the experiment, but there are I guess the claim is there are always philosophical claims that have a bearing on the whatever experiment that you're doing. So if the experiment lasts 6 minutes and you think the universe is going to end in 5 minutes, you're not going to do the experiment. Similarly, if you don't believe in causation, that's going to wreck a lot of your experiments, right? And so the claim is not that every philosophical theory is load-bearing with respect to whatever experiment you're doing right now, but the claim is that there are some. Like you're pre-committed to certain philosophical positions as you're running these experiments.
Yeah, I think you're committed to a set of positions, and I'm not sure. I think there are very few philosophical positions that you're committed to, basically, when you do a lot of these experiments. Again, it depends a little bit on what you mean by philosophical position too.
Let's just say irrefutable theories.
So you're saying when you do experiments, you are implicitly assuming some number of, like, again, yes, I think there are things you're implicitly assuming. I just don't know, like when Deutsch says solipsism is anti-solipsism is one theory, philosophical theory that you're assuming, or realism. I don't see why that's true. And I guess basically why in his view, right? Like why, and I mean, you guys aren't him, but why is solipsism relevant to whatever RNA sequencing that you're doing? Like
if you're doing RNA sequencing, it's presumably because you believe that other people exist and it's valuable to understand how DNA works because you want to create maybe medicines or genetic treatments to solve particular diseases. Say you are looking at the RNA sequence because you want to understand something about life. What you're not doing is look at the RNA sequence because you want to understand something about your mind, which is what a solipsist would think, because they would think that they made that RNA sequence and that there aren't other people who even are worthwhile of bringing medicine to because they don't exist. They're just matrix people. And so the RNA example is a good one because if you're doing genetics, it's presumably because you believe there's a real world and there's other people and you want to understand how they work. And you don't think that they're just figments of your imagination. They're not just dream people. That's what solipsism would assume.
Again, like solipsism as a philosophy, you still could be studying whatever you think is interesting because, again, you think that it inherently by the structure of it is interesting, regardless of whether, there is an external reality associated with it. It's
not impossible to be a young Earth creationist and also an archaeologist. There are people, I think Kurt Wise is a person who is such a character. You can have contradictory beliefs in your mind. And you can come up with these crazy bifurcations where you just don't think about religion when you go to work, and then you think about it when you go home, or you come up with some story that God created all the fossils 6,000 years ago, and I'm still adhering to the best principles of science, and I'm still going to make contributions, but it's because I'm trying to figure out what God has done. It's not impossible to have this kind of person, and it's not impossible to be a solipsistic gene sequencer. But I would just claim that these are kind of the outlier cases, and that if we're dealing with the people who are rational and are trying to have consistent worldviews and stuff, that these are mutually exclusive, but certain people don't have to care about mutual exclusivity. It is possible to not care about that. And that's how you can become a young Earth creationist scientist. And so when you talk about it's not impossible to have someone having these views, it isn't. Of course they can do that. It's just not very rational either. Popper's argument against solipsism, this is kind of a tangent, but I think we should get back to the hierarchy of reliability thing. Is that, so he wrote this in Realism and the Aim of Science, and he said that to be solipsistic is to assume that like Mozart's concertos and Bach and Beethoven and the beautiful night sky that you see, all of it has been created by you. And Popper just said, I don't feel like I am as much of a genius as that I could come up with something like Vivaldi's Four Seasons. So if you want to assume you can, by all means. So is that, okay, so just to think about that argument for a second, is that a contradiction? Is that a refutation? It's not. No, it's an argument. It's just an argument. There's no logical dependencies. It's just an argument. But for me, it's a very compelling one. And for me, that's enough for me to assume that solipsism is false. It's not been refuted. It's just that you have to take a position. As soon as you find out about solipsism, you have to take a position. You either assume it's true or you assume it's false, or you do the Bayesian stuff, but let's ignore that. And so choose, right? This is not a refutation. It's just, you have to assume the truth or the falsity. I find all the arguments against solipsism to be far more compelling than in favor of it, but that's not a refutation. Yeah. And so I just want to make that clear that this is how you can determine the truth and falsity of logically irrefutable theories.
Okay, great. So I think we're going to wrap it here. There are things in the essay we didn't touch on, so I encourage people to go read it. Again, I'm not, there's lots I disagree with. There's some I agree with. But I wanted to have you on both to just give you a chance to like talk through the thesis and for us to discuss and hopefully converge a little bit. But also because I was pretty disappointed by the response to your essay in the broader crit rat community. And this isn't to say I think people should like agree with it and then, go to bed and change their behavior. But I saw basically just like people yelling at you on Twitter, or, people criticizing you for psychologizing the Deutschian community and then going on half an hour spiels psychologizing you personally in pretty like rude ways. So just like a bizarre defensive response that is not at all part and parcel of what I think Popper's philosophy is all about. And I would have expected just like more, I guess, respect in some sense in dealing with critics, but just a more open-mindedness about like hearing some of your criticisms and then like a more serious defense and debate about the topic. So, and again, this isn't to say that I expect people to converge on your opinion or something, but I just expected just a more mature and aristocratic response to criticism in some sense instead of like tantrums being thrown by people on Twitter. So anyway, but I'm glad we had you on and it was a great combo and hopefully people enjoyed it.
Heck yeah, man.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll have many conversations in the future and that'll be fun. Do you want to just tell people where they can find you and also the name of your Substack?
So I'm Kasra Tweets on Twitter. That's Kasra Tweets. I guess I still call it Twitter, maybe X. Start using that. And then my Substack is called Bits of Wonder. If you search Bits of Wonder Substack, it should come up, but the URL is bitsofwonder.co.
And you're pretty easily Googleable. You can just Google Kasra and I think you pop right up. Yeah.
Kasra, Popper, Kasra Deutsch.
Yeah. No last name to slow you down, man. Yeah. Straight SEO, baby. That's awesome. This was a total blast, man. I'm so glad we talked. And let's do many more of these in the future.
Likewise, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.